So, hi, I'm Piotr. I work with OpenCraft. We are developing OpenEdX and managing the client's instances.
And I'm Elton from Microsoft, and as a service engineer, senior service engineer, we've done some edX work over the couple of years. And I guess we're going to be talking about painless upgrades, right? Yep. There we go. So let's get started. Straight out the gate, we're going to be sharing our experiences around upgrading. The most recent experience going from Ficus to Hawthorne. We're just going to talk a little bit about it. And then Piotr is going to come in and talk about some of those pains that we've experienced and the tools to actually help you not to experience those same pains, right? So that's how we're going to split it up today. And let's get started. So first off, when we started our last update, we set up with a couple of principles to get our update done. Number one, we wanted to make sure that we have partners, that our migration plans will work for partners, meaning partners can actually take whatever plans we had and it will actually replicate it on their side very easily as it was easy for us. We wanted to do that. We wanted to make sure our changes were upstreamable, meaning if we wanted to have them upstream to edX, it would be possible to do and not start from scratch. We also wanted to make sure that there were no security exceptions because for the last 3 years we've run edX on our side. Our security team has always had some security requirement that edX just couldn't support. So we had to request security exception. This time around for Hawthorne, we wanted to bring that to an end. And then finally, we made some infrastructure changes here. We'll talk about that in a minute. First off, migrating with partners. When we first did our migration going from Dogwood over to Ficus, we had no partners. There were nobody in the ecosystem that we had to be concerned about. So we did a migration that was live online, meaning very little downtime, and everything just worked. We handled the backward compatibility issues, and everything just worked very well. However, our plan for migration would not be applicable to anybody else. Fast forward to Hawthorne, this time around, we had over 200 partners that we had to be concerned about, and now we wanted to make sure we had a migration that would work for them. Another objective we had was to make sure that we could do a live online migration. Well, guess what? It didn't work out that way for us because the recommendation from edX is much different than what we expect for the live migration. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what we decided to do was we'll take the downtime because we have some other infrastructure changes we needed to make, like moving data from one backend to another backend. So it was kind of okay for us to take the downtime. Minimizing, that was the goal. One more piece I'll call out here. Here are some of the things that we attempted to do. Now, the first thing that we tried was to do a schema diff and update, meaning we'll take a diff of the schema between Hawthorne and Ficus and then roll that up into one giant SQL push, and then we could have the update done within a couple of seconds, and we'll be all happy. It didn't work out that way, right? The keys, it just didn't work out that way, and we found that out very quickly. Unfortunately, we just had to fall back to edX's recommendation, and here is what the recommendation is, right? Straight out the gate. Make a fresh installation, take a new machine, move your data to it. In a large installation, as an enterprise, you most probably are not going to do that, right? It's very hard moving data across. It's a lot of data and everything else. We've had this conversation with the edX team as well, and they're kind of interested in that. And we do have a little recommendation on how we can get to this point, but it is achievable, and I think we're going to get there. Next, upstreamable changes. Now, when we say upstreamable changes, what we're talking about is putting all of your changes behind configurations that will not change the default behavior of edX, right? Because when you're having a conversation with edX about, hey, I want to upstream this change, if your change changes the default behavior of the application, it's almost always a no-no, right? So what you want is put your changes in a way that is fully configurable, you turn it off by default, and then if the user needs this particular feature, you turn it on, and then you have that capability available. So all of the changes we had to make as an organization, we'll talk about why an organization may want to make changes. We had to make sure that they were upstreamable. Now, upstreaming them, that's a conversation he's going to get in here in a few minutes. We'll talk about that, right? But you have to prepare your changes to make them upstreamable. Then you can have the conversation with edX. Couple of recommendations here. You want to minimize as many of the customizations on the edX platform as possible. Lots of things are in transition right now. If you can live on as an institution without making changes to edX, do that. Highly recommended. Don't make any changes, and everything will work well for you. If you must make changes, leverage components, right, like X-blocks and LTIs and external APIs. You want to leverage as much of that as possible if you can. And then finally, as part of changes you're making, you want to start the conversation with edX very early. For us at Microsoft, we have ongoing conversations with edX almost on a weekly, bi-weekly basis that we can talk about changes that we would like to make, and they can provide recommendations, bring the right people into the room. We can say, here are the changes we want to make, how do we approach this, and then they can give some guidance to that. It's very highly recommended that you reach out to edX and talk about these changes before you get into them. So here is an example of some of the pains that we had to go through. About 3 years ago at the conference in Madrid, right, we started having the conversations about GDPR. It was just coming out. And at the time, edX wasn't quite ready yet to get onto that bandwagon, but as Microsoft, we had to deal with the problem. So we ended up going ahead and making changes necessary for implementing GDPR. There's a teammate on our team, his name is Vijay, he's not here today. He primarily worked on some of the work on Hawthorne regarding what we do with GDPR, but I'll explain the story here. With our Hawthorne migration, we had to make a hard choice. Minimize the amount of customizations, right? And at the same time, throw away a lot of work that we already put in. It wasn't our fault that it happened the way it happened, right? edX wasn't quite ready yet until Hawthorne for the GDPR capabilities, but then we wanted it on FICAS, right? That was like some time ago. So that was the dilemma we were faced with. So we did it. Fast forward to Hawthorne, GDPR changes come in, and now we're facing that. What do we do? So we made a hard choice. We'll get rid of whatever we had done before, very hard, but it minimizes customizations. We had to do that. So as an organization, those are some of the hard choices you may have to make. And even though we did that, their implementation doesn't quite support our scenario, because the edX scenario for GDPR is the user requests to delete his or her account, right, as a user driving that interaction. For us, as an organization, you request that your account be deleted from all Microsoft systems, right? So there's a full organizational unit that is responsible for filtering all of those requests. And by the time it's gone through cool off and everything else, then they send a signal to us telling us, delete this account now. We expect you to delete it in like 10 seconds. That's the way it works for us. So the implementation of edX just wouldn't work. What we had to do, we had to approach edX again. We explained the scenario. They understood what it was. We made our recommendations. They thought it was good. We had approvals on that, and then we made those changes. The guy who made the change, he's not here right now. There was Vijay. And rest of the team, we have Brian here as well. He's here. Can you show your hand, Brian? There you go. We kind of worked on this to have some enterprise support for GDPR changes, right? Again, these are some of the changes and considerations you have to make as an enterprise concerning changes on edX platform. Next, security exceptions. Since we've had edX, and I'm sure everybody's aware of it, right? You have your env.json and env.auth.json, right? Secrets are in them. You have some secret things that are in there, right? They're all in plain text on the file system, right? For us, that's been hounding us for a long, long time. And finally, we decided, you know what? We're going to cut the cord here on this one. So edX already is aware. We've had this conversation with them for some time. They're aware of it, and they're making some changes. Fenil is here. There are some configuration changes. I believe you guys have a talk about that today. There are some configuration changes coming on the edX side. Here is the great thing. The way we approached it was, and we had this conversation with them. He was on that call, actually, and he kind of signed off on the approach, right? So going forward, whenever the new thing comes in, it fills in with this approach. Now, this approach here is more about, think about Django storages, the way it works. You have a component that has a number of backends that are implemented. So you just implement an interface here, for example, we're just saying proposing get setting or maybe get settings to get the whole list of them. And then you implement your backend. In our case, it's Key Vault. Your case could be maybe Google KMS or HashiCorp Vault, for example, right? You could have those as your backend. But once you implement according to the interface, now it doesn't really matter what backend you have for storing your secrets. And what we're suggesting is you go into your AWS.py. Hopefully, it's going to be production.py soon. You go in there, and then you're going to override all of your settings that your application needs. So no more do you need to keep secrets on your file system. We had to make this change for our purposes, and then edX is going to come in and make some more changes, but their changes wouldn't be hard for us to adopt. Why? Because we've had this conversation with them already. One more piece here. We made some infrastructure changes. This is more for us. If you're on Azure and everything else, there were some problems we had, and a lot of our partners, we had a big ecosystem of partners. One of the big complaints was our system was more VM-based. We had our backends, MySQL backends, and then the Mongo backends. These were all VM-based solutions, and they were a bit costly, right? Number one request from our partners. So we had to make some adjustments to accommodate that. And with Hawthorne, we made that simple change in our infrastructure. And this is what it looks like now. Just a little change. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the Mongo piece in. We actually did the work for it. with Mongo Atlas. There were some configuration changes necessary to support Mongo Atlas on edX right now. It's not fully compatible. There were some changes we had to make for that, but we back it up because we couldn't work out the arrangement properly with the MongoDB team itself. But we did get it done for the MySQL, and it kind of worked. And that's like 60% plus savings on the infrastructure cost that you're talking about right there. Now, here is where we come down to. Number one, limit the use of custom code as much as you can. That's a very strong recommendation. As an enterprise, there are many reasons why you want to make customizations, right? You want to support your business scenario. But if you can go away from custom code, do that, number one. If you can't, for any reason, try to get your changes upstream, because then you have a whole community of developers actually supporting your work over time. You don't have to keep supporting and changing and updating and migrating your code. You have the entire community behind you once you have your changes upstreamed. Next, if you're making those changes, you want to make them pluggable components, and you can see the edX infrastructure is actually changing right now with microservices and everything else. You want to start matching that pattern right now because that's where they're going. You want to match where they're going so that once they get there, you're already ready to go as an organization. So, for example, our GDPR changes, right? We had to support enterprise scenarios where a signal comes to say, delete this account, right? And then it gets deleted. On edX, the change comes from the user going into the interface and say, delete my account. That scenario doesn't work for us. It would never work for us. That's a separate workflow that we're talking about. On the back end of that, edX actually uses a series of back-end processes that will process all of those accounts that have been marked for deletion and have completed the cool-off period. All of that is happening for us. That is not applicable for us. So we have to make those changes. Now, the next thing is, when we talk about upstreaming those changes, meaning we get it into the edX platform itself. We push those changes so the entire community benefits from it. Some cases, it's not applicable to everybody else. It's just for you. So this is where we usually have the problem. Some cases, they're applicable. We've had a number of security changes Brian has worked on. He's our security guy. He's working on a number of security changes that we're actually, upstreaming now, right? In the process of upstreaming that to edX, and then the entire community benefits from it, right? Finally, the last piece here is backward compatibility. One of the big problems that we ran into when we did our recent migration was around if you do a live migration, as a requirement for that, you need to make sure that backward compatibility is ensured. Because what's going to most probably happen, you're going to update your backend, your old front ends will still be talking to that backend, and if they break, then your site is down. It defeats the purpose of a live migration. So I think one of the things that will get us to the point of enabling live migrations, I believe, is to make sure that whenever we are designing those migrations in the edX platform or wherever we're designing them, let's make sure that we have considerations for backward compatibility. Otherwise, live migrations will be completely impossible. It would just not be possible. And I think that's a recommendation that the edX team can take to move this forward. So finally, you've heard about how not to make customizations on a platform. If you can avoid them, avoid them. But if you are making those customizations and you intend to upstream them, here is how you do it. And I'll switch over to Piotr, and he will take it over.
Yep. Thanks. Okay, so now let's talk about contributions. Yeah. The first type of contributions are bug fixes and documentation improvements. Actually, those are always welcome because there are always bugs. When I first switched from proprietary software to open software, it struck me that you can just fix everything. You don't need to file a ticket to a maintainer. You can just fix everything yourself. And it's actually really awesome in the open software. So yeah, let's just use it. Okay, so the next type of contribution is actually a feature instead of a bug. So yeah, before actually creating a fully fledged PR with the tests and everything, you may need to reach out to your open source contribution manager, because if it doesn't align with the roadmap of the edX, it might get just rejected and you'll be upset. Don't get upset, reach out to your open source contribution manager. Yeah, so before you need to know if your proposed changes align with those roadmaps. or maybe if you need to make some changes to it, or maybe it will be a plugin that will be connected to the core because it won't be suitable for upstreaming to the core. Yeah. You also want to schedule your review with the manager, just to make sure that your timelines will be met. Okay, the next one is unit tests and integration tests. You may use the edX API in case that is not documented, for example. So you may want to write your own unit tests to just protect those changes, to make them retainable between the next releases, to make sure that it won't just break during the updates. Yeah. Okay. So, why would you like to contribute to avoid the code drift, and what is it? The code drift is actually are actually all the changes that are on your branch and that aren't on the master branch. So when the new release comes up, you'll have bad time updating your instances. So you can just use the new version, right? If you don't have any custom features on your own instance, then you can just switch the branch and it should work. But well, if you do, you will lose all your features, and most users become quite angry when they lose the new features. At least I do. Yeah, but by the way, there was a reason the drift occurred, right? Okay, the next one, you can just rebase upstream on your fork. Yeah, and that works, but it depends on how much drift there exists. Because if you have much drift, you will spend plenty of time updating your instance. The same applies to rebasing changes, upstream changes on your version. It's the similar situation. If you just don't upstream your changes, you will end up maintaining it for your whole life. And yeah, I hope nobody does that. Okay. Yeah. This is pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, you get the feature or the bug fix, so we can advertise that you have the instance on which it works, where it doesn't work on the other instances. Yeah, why not? I once felt tempted to do this, and I admit that I have done this. It was a script for the VPN, and there was a Cloudflare DNS that was 1111, which was pretty fancy, but it wasn't supported, so I patched it myself on my computer, and then somebody fixed this in another way, which wasn't compatible with my change, so it ended up breaking on my computer, and yeah, I don't recommend it, actually. Actually, if you want upstream your change, upstreaming the change increases the cost, of course. But maintaining it for the whole life is usually much bigger. Okay. What if you really can't upstream this, if it gets rejected? You can just edit some parts of code to make it pluggable, like Elton said. You may just define the custom overrides for some features and just plug in your changes, make separate Django app, which will utilize them. Okay, named releases. So what are the benefits of the updates? Of course, those are bug fixes, as we mentioned. People just submit their bug fixes to open source. And if you skip those upgrades, you will end up backporting all the bug fixes to your instances, which will eventually lead to the code drift, because code changes between the releases. And yeah, it will just be harder. Yeah, the next one are the new features. They are actually similar to bugs, but yeah, that's actually the same. And the maintainability is also the additional cost when you skip the upgrades. For example, if you are still using the Vagrant dev stack, you probably had some problems with deploying it because some GPG keys are expired, so you need to manually put them into your instance, or some repositories are obsolete. So yeah, actually it's pretty hard to deploy Vagrant DevStack after some time. For example, after the recent changes of the Ruby version. Yeah, I don't think we need to explain this one. The Django gets CVE sometimes, so we need to make sure that our users' data is protected and secure. Okay, so how to prepare, actually? We should determine what steps we need to take for the new release to be update the release to the new one. And you also want to prepare a list of how you can automate or improve the things during the updates. Yeah, so the things you want to keep track of is what PRs are actually at drift, because yeah, let's be honest, it takes some time to upstream your changes, so you may end up just having them on your own and waiting for the upstream to backport them later. So you need to keep track of them. You also need to be aware of any other issues that may occur that you observed on your own release. Okay, the next thing are migrations. For example, for the first question, can database migration be done in one step? So we were actually upgrading from Ficus 3 to Ginkgo 1, but we couldn't upgrade it in one step because we needed the intermediary release to be for the update. So we needed to upgrade to Ficus 0.4 first, and then to Ginkgo. Okay, the next one, are there any breaking migrations? So yeah, if you're upgrading, for example, from Ginkgo to Hawthorne, you need to make sure that after you run your migrations, and you need to, for example, revert all your instances back to Ginkgo, they will just work with some changes, but maybe not many, if something breaks. Yeah, so the checklist is just to test it from scratch, to determine what tasks block the deployment, to test the migrations. And yeah, I recommend you to just write down all these things somewhere to be aware what issues you may stumble upon during the upgrade. About the themes, yeah, you just want to spawn a new instance with the new theme and just click around or run your integration tests or other tests that you have. So yeah, you want to make sure that everything looks like it looked before. Okay, so some general advices. If you have multiple clients, you may consider having a single branch from them for all of them that will follow the master branch of edX. So you will just cherry pick all the changes that appear on master branch, and your clients will get them. This is pretty much easier to maintain than having like 50 or 100 different repositories, each for one client. Yeah. And if you need to develop new features on those instances, you may just gate them by for example, waffle flags or site configurations to just enable them for some of the clients. So you won't need to just push it forward for everyone if they don't want it. Yep, so the next one is automated deployments, which will be deployed, which I will talk about here. So for mass upgrades, we use OpenCraft Instance Manager, OSIM, as a shortcut. So it's pretty useful. We just have our clients' instances in there. And if we want to, for example, deploy a security patch, we just push it to one branch, and just we run one command. For example, let's say we want to upgrade all Hawthorne 1 instances, and we just spawn the new app servers on them, and they are automatically, of course, after deployment succeeds, they are automatically switched to the new app server. So yeah, it's pretty painless, I would say, to do this. OSIM is a Django app that integrates with OpenStack. So we use OVH for hosting this, and it just works. If you want to, for example, prototype a new PR, OSIM has the cool feature that automatically spawns a new app server. When you open a PR to the edX master branch, it just spawns an instance with it, so you can just provide the link for this, so the changes can be tested without deploying them on your local dev stack. And yeah, for example, if you need to test your configurations, how would you do that? You would need to spawn it manually and run Ansible playbooks with it, but it just runs, it just provides all the logs. So yeah, it's really useful. It's also useful for the production, as I said. We recently deployed like 50 or 60 a fix on 50 or 60 instances with just one command, and it took only a few seconds. Okay, so now let's talk about maintainable UI customizations. So yeah, we can use this approach. We can just override the text with the translations, but it's pretty hacky solution. You also cannot actually change the order of the things on your site. So yeah, it has some downsides, but if it's fine for your case, then why not? Okay, we can also change the loaded page with JavaScript. So it's also really hacky, but it works. But yeah, the downside of this is the user may actually see the live changes when the template gets loaded and the JavaScript didn't update it yet. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but it may work in some cases. Okay. So yeah, the other approach would be creating a shared customizable theme. Like you get a skeleton theme, for example, with some configurable variables, which can be set in, for example, Ansible. So you have the separate configs for each client, and you just deploy them with the theme. So yeah, there are many cases where it actually works. If you have many clients, it's just perfect solution. So the other one, the last one actually, is using the edX branding API. So it just works by providing the actual parts of your site in the site configuration. So there are just blocks that are named, and if you want to override it on your site, you just put it in with the Django admin on your site configuration, and it works too. It's not so convenient as having a separate repository, but it's easy to maintain it through the UI upgrades. So yeah, with the new releases, you don't need to test everything just manually, because it just retains. So also, if you don't have a custom block for any part, you can always upstream it to make it configurable. Okay, so the bonus one, do commit messages really matter while upstreaming the changes? So yeah, this is the site what's the commit, and I really like this, so I put it here. This is a live example, actually. I had a colleague with whom I was doing a project, and we agreed to use the PRs there. And yeah, those are, as you can see, binary files. And the commit message says, yeah, so yeah, it's pretty hard sometimes. Okay, so how should actually the nice commit message look like? Here's an example of mine. So yeah, the description is pretty useful for getting the context of a commit. You should reference the PR from there. You should reference the actual upstream commit. If you're backporting the change from the upstream repository, you can reference the original commit so you can have all the context that is needed. So yeah, that's all from me. Any questions?
Back to the discussion of the recommendation on how to perform an upgrade from edX. What would be your recommendation regarding especially the database migration? Because I think it is the most common source of problems when you try to run migration. What would you recommend? To run migrations on the current database with all the data, or to create the brand new database empty and then migrate the data to the new database?
So I will give you how we do it, right? The gold standard, as far as I'm concerned, would be your live database, right? You run the migrations against that database. That will be the gold standard. That will allow you to do live migrations, I think, right? If you have to copy your entire database, depends on how big your database is. If you're like edX, I mean, he's right here. If you were to ask him right now, how long would it take you to copy your entire database to a new instance and run it? It's not feasible. It's just not, right? So the gold standard is to do that. However, for this migration, remember, we had to make some infrastructure changes and move our backend systems. So what we had to do was to provision a brand new backend, move the data to it, and then point our new application servers to it. We had to take a downtime for that. Gold standard is direct on your live database. Of course, you're going to test it before you start, right? You're going to have a copy, some test environment, BVT integration environment, and you're going to run this before, multiple times before. Actually, a lot more, multiple times before to make sure everything works before you do it. When we did our first migration from Dogwood to Ficus, and in both cases, we actually jumped one version, right? We did a live migration. It was very difficult, but we worked out all of the details, and we did a live migration from Dogwood directly to Ficus, right? We did the backend migrations first, and then we brought the front ends, and we made sure that the site was up throughout the time. This time around, we couldn't do it. And that's the push that we want to have. We want to have that live migration. Anything you want to add? Sure. Okay.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. Oh, there you go.
I wasn't sure if I wanted to ask this because I want to caveat this by saying that I 100% agree that you should upstream your changes and do as few customizations as you possibly can. 100%. However, let me run through a case. Like, let's say that you are making some changes and you want to upstream them. And edX says, I'll take 75% of your changes because 25% don't apply. And so you can upstream partial of your changes. Have you now created more work for yourself to figure out how now to plug in what edX has taken versus what they haven't taken when you do an upgrade?
Craft on this one, right? Because I think their motto is upstream everything. So you guys give a first shot at it, right? And then we'll come back to it.
Yep, so actually you need to determine how long are you going to run your instance, because if the upstream changes will override something that you are relying on, then you will have to maintain it in each release, right? So it might end up having being the highest, much higher cost than just upstreaming it on the first place.
I think of kind of GDPR as maybe an example of this. You know, you guys said you had your own customizations, and then edX took some of them. So now when you upgrade, you have to determine how you're going to take edX's changes that they've made for you, but still customize it again for your needs. Was that the case or no?
Yes, slightly different scenario, right?
Yeah.
What we did was we threw away everything that we had done on the GDPR, everything.
Yeah.
everything, right? Hard decision, but we had to do it. After we did that, then we realized their implementation doesn't work for us. And then we found the gaps. And then we had conversations about those gaps. They signed off on our approach to, resolving those issues. And then we started to implement them. And we have them now on our system.
Okay.
That was the approach.
All right, makes sense. All right, thanks, guys.